Yes, thank you, Eleanor and Daniel and Isabel and also Tobias for inviting us to join your lectures. When Isabel sent me the Tobias CV, I realized that I would need like 3 hours to introduce Tobias. So I summarized his CV with some important points. And Tobias Hoffmann is, as you see at the slide, is a professor at University of Sorbonne in Paris since 2021. He got his PhD at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and since 2022, he's the president of the Global Society for Medieval Philosophy. I'm not going to read it in French because the title is in French because I'm not a French speaker, so it would be quite inappropriate. He was also visiting professor at many universities, including Catholic University of America and Catholic University Leuven. Among his many, really many published works, I would emphasize Free Will and the Rebel Angels in Medieval Philosophy, which was published by Cambridge University Press, and also Companion to Angels in Medieval Philosophy, Brill's Companion to the Christian Tradition. He also did a translation, introduction, and explanatory notes for the book by Johannes Duns Scotus, Freedom, Virtues, and Natural Law. So in front of us we have a big expert in medieval philosophy, and we are going to enjoy his lecture. So Tobias, the floor is yours. I hope I didn't summarize it too much.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Zoran, and many thanks, Eleanor, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity. So, Thomas Aquinas on practical wisdom, although I'm going to speak mostly of prudence. It's just that when we hear prudence, we think of maybe not so much in English, but in other languages, like in French, you think about be careful. And prudence is much more than that. It's much more than that. So, I'm going to hold on. I gotta see how to change the slides. Okay. I'm going to give four lectures. The first is today on the background in Aristotle, and actually, I'm gonna end. There's gonna be a little bit of Thomas Aquinas already today. Then, next lecture. Hold on. Yes. Next lecture is on what is prudence in Aquinas. Then the third is the general principles of action, prudence and natural law. And then the fourth and final lecture will be the particular principles of action, the connection between prudence and the moral virtues. And this fourth lecture is the one maybe that I care most about because that's where everything comes together and where we see Aquinas' conception of prudence, which is quite well, it's very strongly dependent on Aristotle and yet very original. We see in particular in the third lecture the originality of Aquinas' thought of introducing, of connecting prudence with natural law, because in Aristotle there is no theory of natural law. There's only a rudimentary, well, awareness that in fact there is something that is right by nature and that there's something that is right by convention. But so Aquinas introduces that, incorporates prudence into his theory of natural law. That's the overview of the next four lectures, including today's lecture on the background in Aristotle. So, uh, yeah, we always have to ask ourselves for everything we do, so what? Why do we do this? What is interesting about prudence and Aquinas? The role prudence plays in an ethical theory is an important indicator of the whole conception of ethics and hence of life of the thinker. That's really so. This small, maybe we can call it lecture series, is part of a larger project where I would like to trace the reception of Aristotle, in particular in the Middle Ages, in particular starting with the 13th century until we'll see how far I get. Certainly until the 14th century, and maybe in the long run until early modern thinkers like Kant and then even 19th century thinkers like Sidgwick. So prudence or practical wisdom plays a key, absolutely central role in Aristotle's ethics and a very marginal role in ethics like Kant's or Sidgwich's. So Kant, deontology, Sidgwick, utilitarianism. For Kant and for Sidgwick, prudential reasonings are not moral reasonings. For Aristotle, prudential reasonings are precisely moral reasonings. So this is a point that I will have to get back to when we end this lecture series. But I just want to announce that there's something really big at stake. So this now to get into today's lecture on the background in Aristotle. This divides into four parts. The first one is a little bit longer. I want to just give the background for people who don't know the Nicomachean Ethics by heart. The moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. Then what is prudence according to Aristotle? Then Aristotle on knowledge and of universals and experience of particulars. Prudence has in particular to do with experience, but not exclusively. And then finally, prudence and art. Art translates the Latin ars, which translates the Greek techne, and can be translated by craft competence, craft knowledge. So art is not so much the fine arts. The examples Aristotle gives is rather medicine, navigation, rhetoric, even political art, connected with rhetoric, convincing people. So prudence and art, that art is or craft knowledge is what comes closest to prudence in Aristotle's account. And so when we see how the two are similar, but in particular how they are different, we can really see what is unique about prudence. And I think that will help us appreciate what is unique about an ethics that puts prudence into the center. I will get back to this very point, then the importance of that distinction also while making that distinction. Then let's start with the first part of today, moral virtues and intellectual virtues. So yeah, the first, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes will be very, very basic, but I think it's good to remind us of maybe not everybody has read the Nicomachean Ethics or not everybody is familiar with it. Virtue comes in when Aristotle talks in the first book about happiness. So the whole Nicomachean Ethics responds to the question, what is the good life? What is a fulfilled life? What is a flourished life? A happy life? And then in the seventh chapter of book one, he first makes the connection between happiness and virtue. And he says that after some reflections, the human good, the human good is happiness. The human good proves to be activity of the soul in accord with virtue. This seems rather obscure, so let's break this down. Activity of soul rather than idleness. Aristotle says you could hardly think that somebody is happy when he is idle. So activity doesn't mean that you have to do all kinds of wild things. Activity is even to watch a theater in the ancient times, or for us to watch a movie. That's an activity. And idleness would be, I mean, so Aristotle says you wouldn't call somebody who's asleep happy. So happiness is activity rather than is found in activity rather than idleness. Then he says of the soul, of when he says the soul, he thinks of the human soul, so of the rational soul. So happiness involves reason. And then finally, what is most interesting to make the connection between happiness and virtue, he says that, well, this activity, this rational activity, in order to produce happiness or in order to contain happiness, has to be found at a level of excellence. Excellence is the Greek word there is arete. The Latins translated arete as virtue, and then as virtus, and then in the English language, it becomes virtue, or then in the French language, vertu. But we have to think back about the original meaning, which is excellence. Okay, now Aristotle makes a brief comment at the end of Book One of the Nicomachean Ethics about the distinction between moral and intellectual virtues. I can already anticipate prudence is an intellectual virtue for Aristotle, but prudence is very strongly, very tightly connected to moral virtues. We're going to start seeing that today, and then also in the next lectures, in particular in the last one. So here is the quote at the end of Book One. For some virtues are called virtues of thought, others virtues of character. Wisdom, comprehension, and prudence are called virtues of thought. Generosity and temperance, virtues of character. I take my translations from the Greek from T.H. Irvin, and sometimes I make emendations. Okay, so here all that is important is that there are moral virtues and intellectual virtues. So what we have to see next is what moral virtues are. Um, yeah, okay, just virtues of thought are intellectual virtues in this, and then virtues of character are moral virtues. So what are the moral virtues? Aristotle gives this definition, which summarizes after long considerations about what virtue is not. He ends up saying then, virtue then is a state that decides. I'm going to give you the Greek in a second, but let's read it like this now. Virtue then is a state that decides, consisting in a mean, the mean relative to us, which is defined by reference to reason, that is to say, to the reason by reference to which the prudent person would define it. It is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. So I'm going to explain each one of these points, but you already see that prudence is mentioned in this definition, and that's extremely important for our purpose. So let's look at this again. But then a state that decides, hexis pro haeretike. Hexis is often translated to Latin, it's translated to Latin as habitus, and then often translated to English as habit. But it's not a habit in the sense that it's something that we do just blindly or just by routine, but it's rather a hexis for Aristotle is a stable disposition. So it's something ingrained in our character. So a hexis, state, a stable disposition, we could say, that decides. So virtue, by the various virtues we're going to see, which kinds, but for example, temperance, generosity, it's about possessing this disposition, but then acting, and then to act, we have to make decisions. So, which is a state that decides, consisting in a mean. That's the very classical Greek idea. A mean, another translation could be a middle, right? A middle position. Mesotheti and mesotheti. So the idea always that virtue is um, doing things or feeling things not too much and not too little. In that sense, it's in the middle position. But a middle position, I mean, relative to us, proshumas, in the sense that Aristotle says that certain things for one person could be rashness, but for others they would be courage. So it depends. Um, for me to run into a burning building would be rashness. For a firefighter, it would be courage. So it's I mean that just like he says, just like athletes have a different diet than normal people, so too, what is the middle position depends on the person that possesses the virtue. So a mean relative to us. Then I already said I highlighted with get back defined by reference to reason, logo. That is to say, to the reason by reference to which the prudent person, Hophronymus, would define it. It is a mean between two vices, one of efficiency and excess. And let's now see this a mean between these two vices. Let's see how Aristotle explains this, or rather illustrates it by means of examples. So he has a whole catalog of virtues where he just presents them without much discussion in Book 2, Chapter 7. He says when it comes to feelings of pleasure and pain, the middle position is temperance, but an excess of enjoying pleasures is of enjoying pleasures is intemperance, and a deficiency of enjoying pleasure is insensitivity. Then, with regard to confidence, the feeling of confidence, courage is the mean between deficiency and excess. The excess would be rashness, to be overconfident. And then the deficiency is cowardice, to have too little confidence. Courage is a complex virtue because it concerns two feelings, but two feelings in a different way, because it also concerns fear. So he says courage is also a middle position between having too much fear, which is then cowardice. The excess then is cowardice in terms of fear. Courage is the mean, and then having too little fear, the deficiency. He says, well, that's something that we rarely encounter, and so our language doesn't have a name for it. Therefore, he says it's a nameless vice. Just two more examples of virtues, and those are going to be the examples that I'm going to use a lot in this lecture and the next ones. So he says, in terms of giving and taking of money, the middle position, the mean is generosity, and excess is wastefulness. Others call it translated by extravagance, and then deficiency is stinginess. And it's quite interesting that he says that this virtue of giving or taking of money can be found also on a large scale. On a large scale, so when it's not about giving the beggar a few euros, but when it's about maybe endowing a chair or endowing a whole building on a campus, or in the ancient times, and endowing either building a temple or endowing the liturgy of a temple for a certain period of time. So that large scale generosity, Aristotle calls it magnificence. And then it also has an excess, which Irvin translates as ostentation, and then deficiency and niggardliness. Okay, so that's just to see what virtues are, this middle position. And now the big question is, Aristotle asks himself, this is so what he does, this is here in book 2, where he introduces we just saw the definition of virtue, and then he gives this big catalog of virtues without much comment. He makes a few other observations, then gets into a few other things having to do with action, but then starts presenting the virtues in detail. Temperance, courage, generosity, magnificence, and a certain number of other virtues. Only in book 6, after having done all these virtues, an important one, of course, which is not in this list here, justice. All of book 5 is on justice. Then in book 6, he starts by saying, well, it's very nice that we are aware, or even we're told, that we should always aim for the mean, but that's quite little information. In fact, he asks, how do we determine the mean? Here I read from the very beginning of the book 6. All of book 6 is on prudence, by the way. I read, since we have said previously that we must choose the intermediate condition, not the excess or the deficiency, and that the intermediate condition is as the correct reason says, let us now determine what it says. To say this is admittedly true, but it is not at all clear. So it's not enough to say, well, always try to find the middle position. You also have to find a way of getting there. And that is where, in fact, he introduces prudence. I mentioned very briefly just now that all of Book 6 is about prudence. Not exactly, strictly speaking, because certain chapters in Book 6 are about other intellectual virtues, such as art, um, scientific knowledge. He has a virtue of understanding first principles, uh, wisdom, theoretical wisdom, meaning a wisdom that doesn't have to do with action, but with knowledge. But in a sense, all of Book 6 is about prudence because he introduces these other intellectual virtues just to bring out more what prudence is. Because in each case, he shows how these virtues are different from prudence. And then once he has introduced all the intellectual virtues, chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then the rest of book 6 is all about prudence. So that is why I said book 6, in a way, has prudence really as the unifying topic. Okay, so that's so far for the distinction between moral and intellectual virtues. So now let's see how Aristotle understands prudence itself. What is prudence? He starts answering this question by saying what is proper to a prudent person. And here I read an extremely important quote from the beginning of the of chapter 5 of book 6. So chapter 5 is all dedicated to just to the definition of prudence. After he had talked about art in chapter 4. So I read, it seems proper to a prudent person to be able to deliberate finally about things that are good and beneficial for himself, not about some restricted area, about what sorts of things promote health or strength, for instance, but about what sorts of things promote living well in general. And here, again, I have to definitely comment on each part of it. So, um, in particular, on two aspects of this quote. To deliberate finely, the prudent person is able to deliberate finely, and then about living well in general. Deliberation, we see here, is crucial for prudence. So we have to take a step back for a second and look at how Aristotle presents deliberation. What is deliberation? What's the point of it? And then we can see why it is important for prudence. So this here, I'm now summarizing Nicomachean Ethics 3, chapters 2 through 4. So the idea is we intend some end. This could be, for example, if I realize that I'm sick, then I may intend health. And this intention of the end in translation, so Aristotle calls it bouloisis, boulesis, sorry, boulesis, we're going to see the Greek in a second, translated as wish. Once we intend this end, we deliberate about how to achieve it. So it could be by well, going to see the doctor, and then maybe the doctor also gives several options. He may say you can either for your health to diminish, for example, your cholesterol, you could exercise more, you could eat a different diet, or you could use a pill, and then I have to deliberate which one I want to do. Um, Deliberation, issues, and choice. So choice for Aristotle is simply that which results from deliberation. When I have come to a conclusion that in this health situation, I'm going to, so I don't want to do a diet and medication is exaggerated, so I'm going to do more workout, then that is the result of my deliberation. That's my choice. It's not just the intention to do the workout, but it's actually the action of doing workout. So deliberation issues in the action that that is, in fact, that I myself think is most conducive to the end that I intend. And then that action, in fact, realizes my end. So hopefully I will achieve health and diminish the cholesterol, let's assume. Let's see this again just for I'm giving you here for these three notions of wish, deliberation, and choice, and even of end. I give you the Greek and the Latin. This may help. So phronēsis, translated to Latin as voluntas. Voluntas here understood not as the power of the will, but the intention of an end. And here has the word telos. Sometimes he also uses the word scopus, in Latin finis. Deliberation boule, in the Latin deliberatio, or almost in many cases actually entirely a synonym concilium. So the idea that you take counsel, well, in the Aristotelian idea, you take counsel maybe with somebody else, you ask advice of the doctor, or you take counsel even with regard to yourself when you make a decision that where you can yourself make up your mind without asking advice. So deliberation, then in Latin, concilium or deliberatio, that's why in some translations of medieval texts we find the word counsel, which then has the sense of thinking about finding the means to the end, what promotes the end. In fact, here I'm giving you the precise expression in Aristotle. He talks about, in fact, we deliberate about, in the Greek, ton prostotelos, those things, literally translated, those things that are related to the end. Many times this expression, ta prostotelos, in Latin, ea quesunt ad finem, many times this is translated simply as means, and you heard me just use the word means myself, but it's more than means. It's a larger notion than just a means, meaning those things that promote the end are not necessarily only means. This becomes very clear with this consideration. So the overarching end in life for Aristotle is happiness. There are some things that might conduce to happiness as means, but others more as a part-whole relation. So, for example, you would not think that your friends who contribute to happiness are your means to happiness. But of course, and having friendships and enjoying friendships is part of experiencing happiness. At a certain point, also in Book 6 of the Ethics, Aristotle asks, what is wisdom, Sophia, and prudence, phronēsis, what are they good for? And he says, well, they contribute to happiness, but they contribute to happiness not in the sense that wisdom is my means to happiness, but wisdom is precisely what it means to be happy. Wisdom is part of that. So that's why I give you here the original Greek, that which promotes the end, we can say in translation, that which is related to the end, ta prostotelos. Here I'm giving you the genitive ton prostotelos. Yeah, so that's in our health example, that's working out, a diet or medication. Finally, as I said, wish, deliberation issues and choice. The Greek there is phronēsis, translated to Latin as electio. Maybe a good translation to English would be decision, because for Aristotle, electio gives the idea of having necessarily a choice between A and B. And in fact, when they translated the Nicomachean Ethics to Latin, they used the vocabulary that was already in use, and that is in the 12th century, that was already in use in theological texts. And there, the idea was mostly that choice, electio, is about the choice between good and evil. So free will, liberum arbitrium, would be the power of choosing between good and evil, for example, according to Peter Lombard in the 12th century. In Aristotle, the choice is not a choice necessarily among two options. And many times it is two options or even more than two options. It couldn't be even a single option, but in particular, it's not a choice between good and evil. Only incidentally, it can be between good and evil because it's primarily a choice of the means to the end. The means, or in fact, that which promotes the end, in my case, working out. Okay, this is very technical, but extremely important because we will get back to this idea of the means to the end deliberation very much throughout these 4 days. I want to just say very quickly in the English, in this context, we have the word means and we have the word mean. Recall, mean is what translates the mediates, the middle position between deficiency and excess. Means is the instrument, right? So we just got to keep these two words apart, mean and means. Now, after this little excursion to deliberation and choice, we can look back at our text where I said, I mean, which I cited before. I'm only going to read the bold. It seems proper to a prudent person to be able to deliberate finely about what sorts of things promote living well in general. And this latter part is extremely crucial. Prudence, that's in fact, as we may say, practical wisdom. It's not entirely correct on Aristotelian terms to call it practical wisdom, but Aquinas actually finds a way to justify calling it practical wisdom. Well, prudence or slash practical wisdom is not concerned with any kind of deliberation. So it's not concerned with a deliberation of how I best invest my money or about how best I achieve peace, I hope, or for others, how best I win a war. Why? Because these are all partial aspects of life. Um, living prudence is about living well in general. So investing money can be an important part of life, perhaps, but it's not what life is all about. In fact, I I insist on the Greek here to oizen holos, the living well. I wouldn't maybe translate as urban in general, but as a whole, holos as a whole, which is not only in the sense that the prudent person deliberates well about what to do from now until the end of life. We don't know that. We can't deliberate about what happens in 10 years if we live for 10 years. But about life as a whole, more in the sense that about all aspects of life together. And even today, a conversation I had with a friend and colleague, um, a certain topic illustrates, I think, that we need something where we deliberate about life as a whole and not about only aspects of life. I mentioned a situation where I'm trying to finish the editing a book and in collaboration, and one of our authors whom I asked to do some more corrections. Well, my co-editor said, "Be careful. Don't ask her that." I had spent hours on working through the paper, and she said, my co-editor said, don't ask her that because you must know that the person is living through a difficult moment right now. Um, Now, here I'm deliberating about how I can finally publish this book, but I have to take into account also what is what is happening to a person, um, which is not it's not a technical question. This is maybe the point. We are not Prudence is not about technical deliberations. Technical deliberations are about how best to achieve, for example, my book project. But here, what comes in here is a human deliberation. Okay, but a book project is only part of life. It's not the whole of life. And here is at stake the good, the well-being of a colleague. So perhaps I have to rearrange, perhaps I have to um, set you know, give her the time she needs, even that if that is if that is not the best thing from the point of view of from the merely technical point of view of achieving um, ach finishing the book project. So you see, I think you see how prudence has to do also, for example, with professional decisions, but only insofar as they relate to life as a whole. Because otherwise, it's more something having to do with a craft, how to do our profession well. This, so this is something that you really have to mentally flag. Yeah, of course, gotta move on to the next slide, but um, this idea of living well in general, because the whole conception of prudence and therefore what it is also what it is not depends on that. And perhaps just one more thing that needs comment on this page. Here, Aristotle says what is beneficial. So the person deliberates about what is beneficial for himself or herself. Um, but later he makes clear that prudential reasoning is not something where somebody in a selfish way thinks about how best to achieve his or her own personal happiness. Rather, he has a whole chapter on the political dimension, meaning on the how prudence is related to the relationship with others, and where he says that you cannot separate prudence from what he calls politike, which is difficult to translate. Some people will translate it as political prudence, but that's already an interpretation. Well, politike that which has to do with the administrating a state. So he says you cannot be prudent without having also this politique, and you cannot have politique without being prudent. So, in other words, prudence is necessarily related also to other people. Okay, here I already commented on how everything turns on what it means to live well, holos as a whole. With that, Aristotle comes to just a few lines further down to a definition of prudence. Prudence is a disposition grasping the truth, hexis alete, involving reason, concerned with action about things that are good or bad for a human being. So for me, this definition does not do much work. It's for me in a way less interesting than what we just saw before, but I give you this definition also. Now, just one more point about the conception of prudence, that is how it relates. This is the third point for today, quite brief. I only have two slides on this. How prudence requires knowledge of universals and experience of particulars. There are several passages in Aristotle on this, but I'm giving you just two of these, which I think it is something important to keep in mind, in particular for when we see what Aquinas makes of prudence in the next two lectures. So Aristotle says, nor is prudence about universals only. It must also acquire knowledge of particulars, since it is concerned with action, and action is about particulars. In other words, I mean, none of our action, we don't act universally. All of our actions are concretely having to do with particulars. I continue reading. For someone who knows that light meats are digestible and healthy, but not which sorts of meats are light, will not produce health. The one who knows that bird meats are light and healthy will be better at producing health. So the general is just light meats produce health. Something more particular is bird meats are light and therefore healthy. And I continue reading. And since prudence is concerned with action, it must possess both the universal and the particular knowledge, or the particular more than the universal. And I think that's very important. So Aristotle does not deny that we have to know some general moral truths in order to make good decisions about life as a whole, and therefore moral decisions. But he insists much more on the knowledge of the particulars. So you have to, yeah, in fact, prudence is about making decisions. Decisions are about choices and therefore actions, and that is in the particular. Another quote on this, in fact, particular knowledge is acquired through experience. And so I read, whereas young people become accomplished in geometry and mathematics and wise within these limits, prudent young people do not seem to be found. The reason is that prudence is concerned with particulars as well as universals, and particulars become known from experience. But a young person lacks experience since some length of time is needed to produce it. So, great. The importance then, prudence is about particular knowledge. Particular knowledge is acquired through experience. Now, I would like to turn to the fourth section and the last section of today, which is prudence and art. Art, we call it in the sense of craft or craft knowledge. And in fact, Terence Urbans usually translates art as craft or craft knowledge, which I think is legitimate. So, as I mentioned, it's very important to see the difference between prudence and art in order to see what prudence is, and as we will see in a minute, in order to see what kind of ethics Aristotle has in mind when he insists on the importance of prudence. So, therefore, the first point, I mean, or actually the whole point to clarify is, well, I can already anticipate prudence is about acting, art is about producing. And so, to understand the difference between prudence and art, we have to understand the difference between acting and producing. There are few passages of Aristotle on this. Here is one. For production has its end in something other than itself, but action does not, since its end is acting well itself. In other words, if I produce, I don't know, let's assume I'm a cabinet maker and I produce a cabinet, then the end, meaning the goal, what I want to achieve by it, is not producing a cabinet. I mean, it's not the activity of producing, but it's the cabinet, the result. That's the end. In action, it is different. Action is not, Aristotle says, action is not about achieving a result, but about acting itself. This he says in one sentence very quickly. You would need a lot of nuance here because it's sometimes we also act for the sake of something else. But what is certainly clear is that we never, or set aside maybe ergotherapy, we don't produce for the sake of producing. But many actions, in particular moral actions, are done because they are, as Aristotle says, kalos, they are beautiful, noble, because they're the right thing to do. Another longer quotation, this one is not from the Nicomachean Ethics, it's from the Metaphysics. And when Thomas Aquinas explains the difference between acting and producing, he always cites this quote. And in fact, we will see that, if I recall, also in a passage later today. If not, we will see it again a little later in the next days. So I don't want to explain every aspect of this quote, but mainly the main things that come out clearly as the distinction, also thanks to the examples that he gives. He says there, where then the result is something apart from the exercise, the actuality, the energeia, is in the thing that is being made. For example, the act of building is in the thing that is being built, and that of weaving is the thing that is being woven, and similarly in all other cases. I could translate this, I mean, roughly also by saying the point there, the actuality, but also the point of building is not the building, but the thing that is being built. The point of weaving is the thing that is being woven. And when I say the point, then I use basically another word for the end of building, right? The end of weaving is the result. But then he continues and he makes the contrast. But where there is no product apart from the actuality is present in the agents. For example, the act of seeing is in the seeing subject, and that of theorizing, of meaning of contemplating or of doing philosophy, if you want, that of theorizing in the theorizing subject, and the life is in the soul. So the point here is productions, the activity goes outside of the activity itself toward a product, whereas in action, it's not, as Aquinas will then say, it's not a transient movement toward the outside, but it remains in the agent. So seeing is not something that has an outside result, it remains in me. Watching a movie, thinking about something, remembering something. Um, Now, a passage, I'm jumping actually way back to the relative beginning of the Nicomachean Book 2, Chapter 4, a passage that brings out nicely again the difference between acting and producing is where Aristotle does not talk directly about acting and producing, but rather about what is required for virtuous action and what is required for art. And there, I mean, incidentally, it's of course what is required for art, meaning for production, as opposed to what is required for virtuous actions, meaning for actions. So let's read this. This is absolutely important. And many times also, I mean, this is the medievals who read Aristotle then make a lot of this quote. Moreover, in any case, what is true of the crafts is not true of virtues. For the products of a craft determine by their own qualities whether they have been produced well. And so it suffices that they have the right qualities when they have been produced. But for actions in accord with the virtues to be done temperately or justly, it does not suffice that they themselves have the right qualities. Rather, the agent must also be in the right state when he does them. First, he must know, and then Irvin interprets this, he must know that he's doing virtuous actions. Seems a plausible addition. So he must know. Second, he must decide on them, and he must decide on them for themselves, for their own sake. And third, he must also do them from a firm and unchanging state. State again is hexis, character disposition. So the first part of the quote about products of art, he says here, whether they're um, what counts is not the way in which they were produced. In other words, perhaps a fantastic piece of furniture without that we know, maybe we bought it from China and without knowing, or from other country. I mean, this can happen anywhere. Without knowing, um, maybe it's a product of prisoners who are forced to do this. But that's the quality of the chair doesn't depend on whether the producer did it voluntarily, whether he did it on his or her own accord. But for actions, it's not enough that they have a certain result. But what counts is that the agent, he says, the agent must be in the right state. So he must know what he's doing. He must decide on them, meaning he must do them voluntarily, and they must come from a firm and changing state, meaning they must express who he is. They must be in character, so to speak, rather than out of character. Now, I would like to turn, and this I'm coming actually, it's well, gonna use another perhaps 10 minutes. I'm coming to Aquinas now. We're still kind of in the background in Aristotle, but I would like to show what Aquinas makes of the some of the texts that we've seen that are about what prudence is, but then also about how prudence is different from the art. So this very text that we have here, Aquinas comments on it in his commentary to the Ethics in this passage. So it's this Aquinas' commentary on the Ethics is a literal commentary, meaning he stays extremely close to the text, except for a few exceptions, which we may see a little later in the next lectures. So there he comments, he says, meaning Aristotle says first, that there is no similarity in art and virtue, since works of art have in themselves what belongs to the perfection of the art. The explanation is that art is the right plan of making things, or the right reason of making things, the right concept of making things, as will be said in the 6 books of the present work, meaning of the Nicomachean Ethics. Making is an operation that passes to external matter, and an operation of this kind is the perfection of the thing made. Hence, in such actions, the good consists in the object made. It is not, sorry, I restart. It is enough for the good of art, therefore, that the things made be good. But virtues are principles of action that do not go out into external matter, but remain in the agents. Hence, actions of this kind are perfections of the agents. So, the good of these actions consists in the agents themselves. Just 2 comments on this. Here, in making this distinction between between making and acting, or producing, making is like, you could say producing, making is the same, between making/producing and action, when he says making is an operation that passes to an external matter and action does not pass into an external matter, that's a tacit quotation from the metaphysics quote that we just saw, where Aristotle said that, for example, there's building is an operation that passes to an external matter. Seeing is, in fact, an activity that remains in the agent. The second point that was already in some sense clear in Aristotle, but I think that that Aquinas brings out even more. Well, productions, the product, the product, meaning the result of a production, is separable from the producer. So much so that all the things that all the objects of production, for example, the cell phone, well, it's there and it's not anymore in connection with whoever it produced it. But so products are separable from the producers. Actions, however, are not separable from the producers. So therefore, products are judged apart from the judged in the sense products are evaluated apart from considerations about the state of mind of the producer. Actions are not evaluated apart from the state of mind of the producer, of the agent. At this point, it's maybe good to make a comment about the wider significance of this idea of what ethics virtue is about acting and not about making. We are not in kind of ethic that insists, well, that insists, certainly, we're not in an ethic that insists exclusively on the results. In fact, it insists much less on the results than, in fact, on the disposition of the person who acts. So we're not at all in an ethic that is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is as if all of what we do is evaluated as a product in Aristotle's or Aquinas' term, that which comes out of what we're doing. So it's separable from us. Therefore, for utilitarianism, whether I act with a good state of mind or a bad state of mind is not important. What counts is the results that I produce. In an ethic like Aristotle, the attitude is all that counts. And then, of course, how does that relate back to our topic of prudence? Prudence is that which by which we deliberate well and by therefore by which we act well, as we have seen with regard to life as a whole. That means we are not evaluated, we're not judged. What counts, that's maybe better. What counts is not what we are able to accomplish in our lives, but what counts is the attitude in which we do what we do in this sort of ethics. And that is what prudence is about, making good decisions while keeping in mind life as a whole, but not producing a certain set of good actions that makes society better. Um, I would like to turn to now to another. This is I'm going to end with just two passages or three from the same article of the Summa Theologia, where Aquinas asks whether prudence is a virtue that is distinct from art. And that is precisely what also Aristotle tried to achieve. I didn't give you all the text of Aristotle on that because, in a sense, Aquinas' summary maybe is more compact, more concise. But Aristotle himself, when he, for example, in book 4, when he talks about what art is, and then in book 5, what prudence is and how prudence is different from art, he very much had in mind this problem of how prudence and virtue differ. Sorry, how prudence and art differ. So I read art is right reason with respect to what can be made, whereas prudence is right reason with respect to what can be done. Now, making and doing differ from one another in the sense that, as Metaphysics 9 says, making is a transient act on an interior matter, for example, building, cutting, etc., whereas doing is an act that remains within the agent himself, that is seeing, willing, and so forth. So then, prudence is related to human acts of this latter sort, which are the use of power, which are the use of powers and habits, in the same way that art is related to exterior makings, since both are reason perfected with respect to the things to which they are related. So then it is clear that prudence is a virtue distinct from an art. You see that Aquinas uses here explicitly the Metaphysics 9 quote, and then relates back to, by the way, that in the same, well, because acting and making are different, so too um, art and prudence are different. In this little lecture series, I cannot give you the further development in scholasticism, but it's quite interesting that an author who generally I admire very much, and I'm quite a big fan of him, John Duns Scotus, in a certain passage, he levels again this distinction, and he says, well, prudence is just like art, and acting is just like producing. And so, and he will say, actually, just like you can have separate arts, one art without another, so too you can have separate virtues, one without another. But don't want to get too far off topic. But what I would like to just emphasize is um, the difference between art and prudence. That prudence is not to be equated with art is extremely crucial, and that how this is crucial, I think, will become clear more in the following lectures, in particular in the fourth one on the connection of the virtues. So, just one more thing from the same article about the difference between virtue and art. There's um, an objection, an opening argument, which helps us again to look at what is essential in prudence. And there, Aquinas writes, as Ethics 6 says, it belongs to prudence to deliberate well. And that's the text that with which I introduced prudence earlier. It belongs to prudence to deliberate well, but as Ethics 3 points out, in the case of some arts, it is likewise possible to deliberate. Sorry, I didn't read it in the right accent. In this case of some arts, it is likewise possible to deliberate. For example, in the case of military art, and the art of governing, and the art of medicine. Therefore, prudence is not distinct from art. Very nicely formulated objection. And to see how what the difference between prudence and art consists in, well, everything depends on what we deliberate about. And in fact, let's read the response. I put in very small again the objection so that you have it there, but then we read the response in larger typeface. Prudence affects good deliberation, meaning prudence accomplishes good deliberation about what pertains to a human being's whole life and to the ultimate end of human life. But in some of the arts, there is deliberation with respect to what pertains to the proper ends of those arts. Hence, insofar as certain individuals deliberate well about matters of war or about nautical matters, they're called prudent leaders or prudent ship captains, but not prudent absolutely speaking. Rather, only those who deliberate well about what makes up a whole life, here you have again holos, we had in the Greek, a whole life, at totam vitam, are called prudent absolutely speaking. So this is what prudence does then. It connects all aspects of life into one and has them all in mind and not just particular ends. So much so that in the example that I gave earlier about a professional case, um, a professional, or let's say a merely craft or art related deliberation would just inquire about how can I best achieve the finishing off of this volume to produce. A prudential reasoning has to take everything into account, life as a whole, and not just an aspect of life. And I will end with that, which I think is a good way to end. Thanking you and thanking in particular Eleanor Stump, Zoran Grozdanov, and Isabel Kortens.